Universalist in a congregation in Ridgewood, New Jersey. And by the way, I'm John Cooper. My minister was the Reverend Kenneth L. Patton, a humanist, an atheist, and somewhat well known in our faith. His reading, "We Arrive Out of Many Singular Rooms," is one of my favorite readings found in our hymnal. I like this reading because it reminds me that when we gather together in worship in community, it is not because we are alike, not because we believe the same things. It's not because we have the same image of God and want to pay homage to that image, but because we are different. We gather because we arrive out of many singular rooms. Because in our own worlds, the way we experience this life, our own creation, we come from singular rooms, yet we arrive together and we seek one another. Our first principle is of paramount importance to building a faith community that can embrace our differences. It is at the foundation of our faith identity, the inherent worth and dignity of every person. It is not an easy principle to embody and uphold. Granted, it seems obvious. But as we go deeper into our faith, as we seek to live to our values and our ethical identity, that principle challenges us to learn how to embrace that which we find difficult. One of the ways in which people challenge our first principle is affectionately known among some Unitarian Universalist ministers as the Hitler challenge. It goes like this. You give a sermon on the first principle, the inherent worth and dignity of every person, their sacred nature, and someone comes up afterwards and says, "Oh yeah? What about Hitler?" Well, we are called to recognize that even the most heinous of criminals bear an inherent worth and dignity. Our first principle does not call us to evaluate the inherent worth and dignity of people who do good works in the world, treat others with kindness, and generally earn the right to be a good person. No. The assertion of our first principle is that innately, essentially, we all have worth. We hold dear that idea of us as beloved of creation. That does not mean we cannot fall, commit cruelties, atrocities, or mistakes. It does not mean that we refuse to demand kindness and justice. What it does mean is we're not marked by an original sin, but by an original blessing. And the challenge of that principle is to learn to embrace that blessing in a way that does not pardon hurtful choices, yet maintains inherent grace and worth in our relationships with one another. It means that we are called to despise the act, but not love the person who did it. Now, some of you may notice that I have used the sin and blessing language. So I think perhaps I should pause for a moment and say something about sacred language. A language of reverence. I choose to claim such language all of the time. So, for the benefit of sharing common ground, let me define what I mean when I say that sacred language. We arrive out of many singular rooms, so we get to define our rooms for each other. We get to share that meaning with one another. Embracing pluralistic community is about listening to one another and learning to be in relationship with our differences. Some of us here today may not believe in God, in sin, blessing, or such religious ideas. Others may inherently believe in a God. What I invite you to do is to define such sacred language to mean what you consider to be sacred. Today, if I say God, then I invite you to think of that word as meaning what you hold to be sacred and dear in your life and in your room. Because that is precisely what I mean by that word. Simply put, I don't get to know how the mystery of life reveals itself to you. You arrive out of your own singular room. I cannot presume to tell you the sacred aspects of creation and how they appear to you. I don't know if when you ponder the mysteries of existence, whether such things appear as an intelligence, evolution, chaos theory, the Tao, Gaia, Odin, Caradwin, or Adonai. Maybe you trust in the Force. Creation has granted each of us a singular room. I can't move into your room. What I can do is respect it, honor it, and cherish that it's yours. Diana Eck, the progenitor of of the Harvard-based Pluralism Project, has framed a call beyond diversity to what she calls pluralism. Diversity is founded on an acceptance of our differences. Pluralism is founded on a celebration of them. Diversity is a fact of demographics. Pluralism is an attitude towards those facts. Among her essays on pluralism on our website, pluralism.org, Diana writes, "From the historical perspective, the terms exclusion, assimilation, and pluralism suggest three different ways in which Americans have approached this widening cultural and religious diversity. For exclusionists, the answer to the tumultuous influx of cultural and religious diversity that seemed to threaten the very core of America was to close the door, especially against the entry of the alien, whether Asian, Catholic, or Jew. For assimilationists, like those who envisioned America as a melting pot, the invitation to new immigrants was to come, but leave your differences and angularities behind as quickly as possible. Come and be like us, come and conform to a predominantly Anglo-Protestant culture. For the pluralists, like Horace Kalin in the early 20th century, the American promise was to come as you are, with all your angularities and differences, pledged only to the common civic demands of American citizenship. Come and be yourself, contributing in your distinct way to the orchestra of American civilization. Our first principle calls us to practice pluralism. It calls us to find a common ethic that is based upon secular ideals of how we want to be in relationship with one another, what common values we wish to share in community. And then it calls us to learn to embrace our different beliefs, perspectives, and sacred identities in a way that celebrates those differences. If each of us shares an inherent worth and dignity, each of us arrives out of many singular rooms, then being together requires us not only to accept our differences, but to embrace them, to learn how to hold them with one another in a way that does not try to force assimilation or exclusion. Our first principle is a theological statement about the nature of creation. Among those of us who practice liberal faith, and liberal here means freedom of belief, not a liberal political identity. Among those of us who practice liberal faith, theology has come to mean the discipline of meaning-making. My own theology professor at ILIV, somewhat renowned, Dr. Edwin Antonio, said to us once in lecture, and honestly, he's from South Africa, has a very strong accent, so I'll try to do it justice because it was simply beautiful. He actually said, "Theology is the way we make meaning of the world. Theology is the way we make meaning of the world." So if you embrace your power to define sacred language as speaking of that which you find holy and important in the world, then your theology is the process through which you come to know the meaning of what is sacred and holy to you. This is the power of our faith and the power of our first principle. Each of us has our singular rooms. Each of us gets to hear the still, small voice of the sacred amidst the noise of creation. And then each of us gets to make meaning of that voice. We can marvel at the wide diversity of faith that calls to us. Some of us may find God in that voice. Some may find mystery. Others may find puzzles to be solved. Our first principle calls us to recognize that each singular, unique song which speaks to us out of our room is ours to embrace. And it calls us to recognize that among the billions and billions of us that are on this planet, there are literally billions of rooms. In 2008, speaking at a Unitarian Universalist congregation in New York, Diana said, "The world has need of your theology. In a world divided by race, by religion, and ideology, the very presence of a church like yours, committed to the oneness of God, the love of God, the love of a neighbor, and service to humanity, is a beacon. Be bold in proclaiming it." When Diana says the oneness of God, the love of God, she is not speaking of a single concept of God that would exclude anyone. there's simply no way the director of the Pluralism Project could mean something like that when she talks about God. No, she's speaking of a concept of God that allows us our singular rooms, that allows us our inherent worth and dignity. Not a God who cursed us or cast us out from a garden, but a God who stays with us and loves us, whoever we are, whatever our experience of creation might be. That God is our theological inheritance as Unitarian Universalists. A God that can be anything, even non-existent. And still, each of us gets to be blessed and beloved of creation. At the core of our theological identity stand two heresies, two beliefs that were bold enough to stand against oppression and judgment. From our Unitarian inheritance, we gain a principle of unity. Not sameness, not similarity, but solidarity. Transcendentalists and theologians of our Unitarian heritage, like Ralph Waldo Emerson, speak to us of a unity in creation. Emerson wrote, we live in secession, in division, in parts, in particles. Meantime, within man is the soul of the whole, the wise silence, the universal beauty, to which every part and particle is equally related, the eternal one. And this deep power in which we exist and whose beatitude is all accessible to us is not only self-sufficing and perfect in every hour, but the act of seeing and the thing seen, the seer and the spectacle, the sun and the object are one. We see the world piece by piece, as the sun, the moon, the animal, the tree, but the whole of which these are shining parts is our soul. From our Universalist heritage, we gain a theological identity of inherent holiness, universal worth, and salvation. Central to our Universalist heritage is Hosea Ballew's classic, A Treatise on Atonement. Hosea Ballew wrote, first, I reason, from the nature of divine goodness, in which all pretend to believe, and none dare in a direct sense deny, that God could not, consistently with himself, create a being that would experience more misery than happiness. Secondly, if God be infinitely good, his goodness is commensurate with his power and knowledge. And then all beings whom his power produced are the objects of his goodness. And to prove that any being was destitute of it would prove that deity's knowledge did not comprehend such a being. Thirdly, there's as much propriety in saying that God is infinite in power, but that he did not create all things, as there is in saying, though God be infinite in goodness, yet part of his creatures will never partake of it. It might as well be said that God is infinite in knowledge, yet ignorant of the most parts of events, which are daily and hourly taking place, as to say that he is infinitely good, and yet only a few of his creatures were designed for happiness. Fourthly, if the Almighty, as we believe him to be, did not possess power sufficient to make his creatures happy, it was not an act of goodness of him to create them. By the way, in a passage that I found kind of humorous, Hosea Ballew argued that there is, in fact, an Antichrist in the world, and his followers would be those who, in the name of apostolic purity, have perpetrated violence and mass death and evil in the world. I love Hosea Ballew. His theology is wonderful and breathtaking. It's forgiving. He's also quoted as saying, there is no such thing as best in a world of individuals. Hosea Ballew truly expressed the inherent worth and dignity of people. That's the inheritance of our faith. Singular rooms coming together in community in recognition that each of our unique rooms has inherent worth, granted by creation, no matter what we believe about that creation. And that, too, is what makes our practice of the first principle challenging. If we're committed to the ethic that every soul is endowed with inherent worth and dignity, we cannot condemn even those who challenge our understanding and values. We can mourn their choices, challenge their actions, demand that they embrace one another. But the idea of a bad person is fundamentally non-existent. There are those who, in anger, hatred, or misunderstanding, might have made evil choices, but there are not evil people. This can be a challenging pill to swallow. And it is this aspect of our meaning that leads some to say that we Unitarian Universalists have no concept of evil, Our concept of justice is reconciliation, not condemnation. Still, we have our understanding of evil, just not of evil people. During her 2002 lecture on a theology of religious education, the Reverend Dr. Rebecca Parker, Unitarian Universalist and president of the Starr King School of Ministry, articulated a very clear Unitarian Universalist understanding of evil. Dr. Parker says that when oppressive empires organize themselves into things that oppress human beings, that is evil. And we are called to resist it through love, choice, and democratic decision-making. When human beings in such systems grow complacent with those structures that oppress human life and liberty, we have fallen prey to evil. Generally, if you divide human beings into those who are loved by God or creation and those who are not, that is bad. You know, if you look at the current political and public rhetoric, it is fundamentally based on dividing us into those who are deserving and those who are not. According to Reverend Dr. Parker, to us, that's just evil. As Unitarian Universalists, we fundamentally oppose such divisive thinking, and we abhor the actions that divisive thinking invites us to commit. That's our calling in our first principle, to walk in unity as a people of pluralistic identity, and to resist anything that diminishes the worth and dignity of any of our billions of singular rooms. Our first principle does not wash the world, allowing anyone to do anything. To the contrary, it calls us to love the uniqueness of each person, to grant them worth and value in a place in creation, and then to challenge with all that we are anything that oppresses and divides people, setting one above another. I remember an experience early in my studies of chaplaincy. I was called in late at night to be with someone whose elderly father was dying. As we spent time together, struggling to make sense of the loss, as she felt cared for and supported by this stranger in a hospital room, her worldview entered into our relationship. She said to me, "You are a nice man. Are you saved?" Our conversation moved to whether or not my soul was saved. I grew defensive, afraid. I tried to defend my room. And our first principle called me not to blame her, but to struggle to learn what her words meant to me, to value, try to figure out how to affirm and promote her paradigm that challenged my own. I learned something about sacred language, which I invited you to embrace for this sermon. I learned that in her sacred language, saved was a way of expressing a desire for me to experience the love of creation. It's funny, at first, during my pastoral education, again and again, I encountered people who wanted to save me, convert me to their faith. Then one day, I realized suddenly I had stopped encountering that conversation. It's not that I stopped encountering the people. They were still there. The conversation changed. I noticed that I listened instead of defending. I was valuing what they meant in their language instead of what I projected into it. Recently, when a patient's family member asked me if I was saved and a follower, not a fan, I realized that I asked what he meant instead of arguing. As we talked about what it meant to be a follower of Christ, to practice charity and love, a funny thing happened. Even though he knew that my faith identity was not at all the same as his, he asked me to pray for his mother. We came to appreciate each other's worth and dignity, even if our singular rooms were very different from one another. That's the power of the challenging practice of our first principle. When we remember that we are called to treat others with worth and dignity, to appreciate that which is different, to name evil as something that happens to people instead of something they are, we find connections and unity. It is as if our sense of universal worth and dignity brings us to a place of unity in our diversity, a place of pluralism, a place where appreciation and love allow us to be with one another even when we powerfully disagree. Being a Unitarian Universalist is not easy. It doesn't mean you get to believe or do anything. It means that we affirm, promote, and engage creation in a way that calls everyone to their own experience of the sacred and holy. It means we arrive out of many singular rooms, embracing one another even when we find doing so challenging and difficult. It means we validate the worth and dignity of every room, that we choose to bless every singular room and call it to its best presence in the dissonant, plural realm in the diversity of creation. So go forth and bless the world, every singular room. Let no instance of evil that separates us from the sacred voices that speak in the billions of unique songs stand unchallenged. And remember, nobody said that being Unitarian Universalist was supposed to be easy. I invite you to rise and join us for our closing hymn, hymn number 128, For All That Is Our Life.